In 2017, a University of Toronto archaeologist named Patrick McGovern sent a team to a Neolithic village site called Gadakrilli Gora, 48 kilometers south of Tbilisi. They were not looking for wine. They were looking for pottery sherds, the kind of broken domestic ware that accumulates in soil layers like sediment in a pond. What they found instead were traces of tartaric acid, malic acid, citric acid, and succinic acid baked into the inner walls of large ceramic jars. The combination is chemically specific. It does not occur in nature through any process except the fermentation of crushed grapes. The jars dated to approximately 6000 BC. That is not the oldest fermented beverage ever found, but it is the oldest wine. And it pushes the story of winemaking back 3 centuries further than anyone had previously documented. McGovern published his findings in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in November 2017. He noted that the jars, some large enough to hold several liters, had been buried up to their necks in the earthen floors of houses. This was not accidental storage. Someone had engineered a temperature-controlled environment. Someone, 8,000 years ago, understood that wine needed to be kept cool. That person has no name. No grave has been found with certainty, no skeleton identified as the first winemaker. What remains is the chemical signature of what they made, still legible in broken clay. To understand what wine became, you have to understand what it was in those early centuries. Not a luxury, not a symbol of refinement, not the object of sommeliers and auction houses. It was a survival technology. Wild grapes in the South Caucasus, the region that straddles modern Georgia, Armenia, and northern Iran, fermented spontaneously when crushed. The sugars converted to ethanol before the juice could spoil. For a Neolithic community with no refrigeration and no germ theory, a liquid that resisted bacterial contamination and provided calories was not a pleasure. It was a solution. The vine, Vitis vinifera, is native to that corridor between the Black Sea and the Caspian. Its wild ancestor, Vitis sylvestris, still grows there in hedgerows and forest margins. Sometime between 8,000 and 6,000 BC, in the same rough period when humans in the Fertile Crescent were beginning to cultivate wheat and barley, people in the Caucasus began selecting grape varieties. Not consciously, not with any theory of genetics. Through repetition, planting seeds from vines whose fruit was sweeter, larger, more reliably fermentable. Over centuries, that selection pressure produced the domesticated grape. Higher sugar content, hermaphroditic flowers that did not require cross-pollination, berries that clung to clusters rather than dropping. The vine had been changed to suit human need, and that change was irreversible. From the Caucasus, viticulture moved west. It reached Anatolia before 5000 BC. It reached the Zagros Mountains of western Iran around the same period. By 4000 BC, winemaking was established in Mesopotamia and along the eastern Mediterranean coast. The Egyptians were producing wine by 3000 BC, though they imported most of what they drank from Canaan and the Levant because the Nile Delta's soil and climate were not well suited to viticulture. Egyptian tomb paintings from Saqqara, dated to around 2700 BC, show grape harvesting, pressing, and jar sealing in sequences detailed enough that a modern winemaker could follow them without significant revision. The Egyptians did something the Georgians had not. They started tracking quality. Jars were labeled with the vintage year, the vineyard region, and the name of the estate manager. A jar from the tomb of Tutankhamun, sealed around 1323 BC, carries a label that reads, Year 5, Wine of the Estate of Aten of the Western River, Chief Vintner Ka. That is not just a record of production. That is a brand. Someone in 1323 BC understood that where wine came from and who made it affected its perceived value, and they thought it worth writing down. Wine's entry into religious practice happened gradually and in multiple places simultaneously. By 2000 BC, wine appeared in Mesopotamian religious texts as an offering to the gods, a substance that connected the human world to the divine. In Canaan, wine was poured as a libation in temple rituals before it was drunk at table. When the Israelites developed their liturgical practices during the period of the First Temple, wine was built into the fabric of worship in a way that grain and oil were not. The Kiddush, the blessing over wine on the Sabbath, preserves that ancient function in a form still performed every Friday evening by roughly 14 million people worldwide. The Greeks accelerated everything. They did not invent wine, but they systematized its production, theorized its effects, and exported both the beverage and its cultural apparatus across the Mediterranean with a thoroughness that no earlier civilization had matched. Greek colonists brought vine cuttings to southern France around 600 BC, planting the first vines in what would become Provence. They established vineyards in Sicily, Sardinia, and along the coast of modern Spain. By 400 BC, wine was not a regional product of the eastern Mediterranean. It was a Mediterranean-wide industry. The Greek relationship with wine was, from the beginning, philosophical. They understood alcohol as a force that needed to be managed rather than simply consumed. The symposium, the formal drinking gathering that was central to Greek intellectual and political life, operated under strict rules. Wine was always diluted with water, typically in a ratio of 1 part wine to 2 or 3 parts water. Drinking it, undiluted, was considered barbaric, the behavior of Scythians and Thracians who did not know any better. The symposiarch, the elected master of the gathering, controlled the mixture and the pace. Getting drunk was not the goal. Reaching a state of loosened inhibition while retaining the capacity for argument was. Plato's symposium takes place at one of these gatherings. The speeches about the nature of love were given by men who were drinking carefully all evening. Dionysus stands behind all of this. The Greeks did not simply worship wine. They built an entire theology around the god who embodied it. Dionysus was not a comfortable deity. He was the god of ecstasy, which the Greeks understood as ekstasis, literally standing outside oneself. Wine's capacity to dissolve the boundaries of the self, to produce states that felt like possession or transcendence, was not incidental to his cult. It was the point. The Maenads, his female devotees, drank and danced until they experienced what the texts describe as divine madness. Whether this was literal or literary is a question classicists have argued about since the 19th century without resolution. Rome inherited Greek viticulture and industrialized it. The Romans were the first civilization to produce wine at a scale that can meaningfully be called mass production. By the 1st century BC, the Roman wine trade involved hundreds of thousands of amphorae moving annually across the Mediterranean. Monte Testaccio, a hill in Rome that rises 25 meters above the surrounding city, is made almost entirely of broken amphora fragments, the discarded containers of olive oil and wine imported from Spain and North Africa. It contains the remains of an estimated 53 million amphorae. That number comes from the archaeologist Emilio Rodriguez Almeida, who published a systematic analysis of the site in 1984. 53 million containers. Each one carried on average 20 to 26 liters. Roman soldiers were issued a daily wine ration. The pasca, a mixture of a sour wine or wine vinegar and water, was standard military issue. It served multiple functions. It provided calories, it made water safer to drink by lowering the pH, and it contained small amounts of alcohol that reduced the rate of waterborne illness in field conditions. The Roman legions that built the empire from Britain to Mesopotamia were, in a practical sense, sustained in part by fermented grape juice. They planted vines wherever they went. The legionary camps in Gaul became permanent settlements. The settlements required supplies. Wine was easier to produce locally than to import, and the climate of central and northern Gaul while marginal for Mediterranean viticulture, was not impossible. The Romans planted along river valleys where the water moderated temperature extremes. The Moselle Valley in what is now Germany, the Rhone corridor, the Loire. The great French wine regions are, in their origins, Roman logistics solutions. When the Western Empire collapsed across the 5th century, wine production did not stop. The institution that preserved it was the Catholic Church. This is the moment where the story takes an unexpected turn, because the Church's interest in wine was not primarily sacramental. Yes, the Eucharist required wine, and that requirement gave every bishop in Europe a theological reason to maintain vineyards. But the monasteries that became the centers of medieval viticulture were also running what amounted to hospitals, and wine was their primary pharmaceutical. Medieval medicine derived largely from Galen and the Arabic scholars who transmitted and extended his work, classified wine as a warming substance that aided digestion, promoted the circulation of the humors, and served as a vehicle for herbal medicines. A monastery's infirmary needed wine the way a modern hospital needs saline solution, as a universal carrier and treatment medium. The Benedictine rule, written by Benedict of Nursia around 530 AD, established a daily allowance of 1 hemina of wine for each monk, roughly 250 to 300 milliliters by most scholarly estimates. The abbot could increase this for monks doing heavy labor. In warmer climates, where wine was abundant, it could be increased further. The monks of Burgundy, working across several centuries from roughly 900 to 1200 AD, did something that had never been done with such systematic attention before. They mapped terroir. The Cistercians at Clos de Vougeot walked their vineyards for generations, tasting grapes from different rows, different exposures, different soil compositions. They began to notice that wine from one specific patch of ground tasted different from wine made 30 meters away under apparently identical conditions. They built walls around their best plots, marking them as distinct. The French word for a walled vineyard, clos, comes from this practice. The concept that the specific geology and microclimate of a precise piece of ground expresses itself in the taste of wine made from it is not a modern marketing invention. It was empirical observation made by monks who were paying close attention to what the earth was producing over several human lifetimes. The Crusades changed the wine map of Europe in ways that are rarely discussed. Crusaders returning from the Levant and their contacts with Arab traders brought back new grape varieties, new techniques for preservation, and a taste for sweeter, more concentrated wines that influenced production in Cyprus, Crete, and the Italian South for centuries. The Malmsey wine that appears in Shakespeare, the wine with which the Duke of Clarence is supposedly drowned in a butt in Richard III, was a sweet Malvasia from the eastern Mediterranean that reached England through Venetian trading networks. Venice, in the 13th century, was the great intermediary, the city that stood between the wine cultures of the Mediterranean and the consumers of Northern Europe, who had the gold to pay for what they could not easily produce themselves. The Protestant Reformation fractured Europe's wine culture along unexpected lines. Northern European countries that adopted Protestantism cut their institutional connection to Catholic viticulture. Monasteries were dissolved. Vineyards passed into secular hands. In England, the dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII between 1536 and 1541 effectively ended English winemaking for 3 centuries, because the expertise had been concentrated in religious houses that no longer existed. The English, who had been significant wine producers in the medieval period, became instead the most important wine importers in the world. Their demand shaped production in Bordeaux, the Rhine, and later Portugal. The port wine industry exists largely because English merchants in the late 17th century needed a wine that could survive the sea journey from Oporto to London without spoiling. They solved the problem by adding grape spirit during fermentation, arresting the process while residual sugars remained. Port was an engineering solution to a supply chain problem. Across the Atlantic, the Spanish and Portuguese were doing what the Romans had done in Gaul, planting vines wherever they established permanent settlements. Hernán Cortés ordered vineyards planted in New Spain in 1524, 3 years after the fall of Tenochtitlan. The vine cuttings came from the Canary Islands, which had served as a supply station for Atlantic voyages since the 15th century. By 1600, wine was being produced in Peru, Chile, and Argentina. The Jesuit missions of Baja California planted the first California vineyards in the 1680s. The mission grape variety that dominated California winemaking until the gold rush was brought from Spain and then moved incrementally northward through the mission system over more than a century. The 19th century introduced industrialization and catastrophe in roughly equal measure. Industrialization first. Louis Pasteur's work on fermentation in the 1850s and 1860s finally explained what had been happening in wine jars since Gadacryli Gora. Fermentation was not spontaneous transformation. It was the metabolic activity of yeast, a living microorganism converting sugar to ethanol and carbon dioxide. Pasteur's research, commissioned partly by French wine producers who were losing product to spoilage, produced pasteurization as a direct result. He also identified the specific bacteria responsible for wine faults, which meant winemakers could, for the first time, understand what was going wrong and why, rather than attributing spoiled wine to bad luck or poor alignment of seasons. The catastrophe arrived from North America. Phylloxera vastatrix, a tiny aphid native to eastern North America that feeds on vine roots, reached France sometime around 1860. Probably carried on botanical specimens imported by French researchers interested in American grape varieties. American Vitis labrusca vines had co-evolved with phylloxera over millennia and were largely resistant to it. European Vitis vinifera had no such resistance. The aphid spread through France at approximately 50 kilometers per year, killing vineyards as it went. By 1880, it had reached most of the major French wine regions. By 1900, it had spread through Spain, Italy, Germany, and Australia. The total area of European vineyard destroyed between 1860 and 1900 is estimated at 6 million hectares. The solution was American rootstock. If European vines were grafted onto the phylloxera-resistant roots of American species, the aphid could not kill them. By 1900, nearly all European vineyards had been replanted using this technique. The vines growing today in Bordeaux, Burgundy, the Moselle, and Barossa carry European fruiting wood on American roots. Every bottle of Chateau Petrus, every Grand Cru Burgundy, every great Riesling from the Rheingau is the product of a hybrid plant. The idea of European wine as purely European, as an unbroken tradition rooted in the same soil for 2,000 years, is a story that phylloxera interrupted and American science repaired. The 20th century brought prohibition in the United States from 1920 to 1933, which destroyed an American wine industry that had been building steadily since the 1860s. It also, paradoxically, preserved a small number of California producers, because sacramental wine was legally exempt. The Beringer family, the Wenta family, and a handful of others survived by supplying wine for religious use. When Prohibition ended, they were the ones with functioning vineyards and institutional knowledge. The California wine renaissance of the 1970s changed the global industry in a way that is difficult to overstate. Robert Mondavi's insistence that California could produce wines comparable to the best French production was treated as either ambition or delusion by most of the wine establishment in the 1960s. The 1976 Paris tasting, organized by the British wine merchant Stephen Spurrier, was supposed to be an interesting curiosity. A panel of 9 French judges, wine professionals of high standing, tasted a series of red and white wines, blind. In both categories, California wines came first. Stag's Leap wine cellars placed above Chateau Mouton Rothschild. Chateau Montelena's Chardonnay beat Meursault Charme and Pouligny Montrachet. The French judges, when the results were revealed, variously disputed the methodology, questioned the selection, and, in several cases, asked for their scorecards back. The results stood. They were published in Time magazine. They could not be undisputed into non-existence. What followed was a gradual democratization of fine wine production. Australia, New Zealand, Chile, Argentina, and South Africa all developed internationally recognized wine industries over the following 3 decades, each drawing on rootstock ultimately descended from the Caucasus, technique derived from French and German practice, and market positioning shaped by the lesson of 1976, which was that wine quality was not geographically predetermined. Today, global wine production is approximately 260 million hectoliters per year, according to the International Organization of Vine and Wine's 2022 figures. Italy, France, and Spain are the top 3 producing countries. The United States is the 4th largest producer and the largest single national market by value. China has become the world's 5th largest wine producer, with plantings in Xinjiang, Ningxia, and Yunnan that have grown from near zero in 1980 to over 785,000 hectares in 2021. The global wine industry generates approximately 36 billion euros in export value annually. More than 40 million people are employed in wine-related work worldwide. The vine is planted on every inhabited continent. None of that begins in Napa Valley or Bordeaux or the Rhine. In the spring of 2022, a team from the Georgian National Wine Agency planted new cuttings of Orkatsiteli, one of Georgia's oldest documented grape varieties, at a site near Gadakrili Gora. The cuttings were taken from vines grown using the traditional Georgian kuvevra method, in which wine ferments and ages in large clay jars buried in the earth, sealed with beeswax. The method is, in its essentials, identical to what the chemical analysis of those 6000 BC sherds suggests was practiced on the same ground 8,000 years earlier. The jars are still buried up to their necks. The temperature is still controlled by the soil. The tartaric acid still forms on the inner walls. The wine made there last year is available for export. You can order a bottle.